But first, my favourite thing about self-righteous politicians getting into trouble is watching how they squirm. These intellectually bankrupt progressives who often campaign on shallow policies lacking in substance get given a free ride in the media. But when it all goes wrong, they are grossly unprepared and struggle to field tough questions from the media, which once praised their every movement. This is the story of climate warrior Zali Steggall, a wealthy Sydney barrister who toppled former Prime Minister Tony Abbott in Warringah by campaigning on climate change.
With politics, an independent MP, Zali Steggall, has come under fire for failing to declare a $100,000 donation from coal investor John Kinghorn's family trust. Steggall received 8 donation pledges, all below the declaration limit. But a review by the Australian Electoral Commission found they were delivered as a single cheque. Steggall's office amended the donation declaration in January last year.
That's right. The Sydney Morning Herald revealed that Steggall won the seat of Warringah with the help of $100,000 in funding from a coal investor. What a hypocrite. And to make matters worse, even though the money was given to her campaign with a single cheque, her team split it up into 8 separate donations of $12,500. It is worth pointing out that the threshold, which would require her to name the donor, was $13,800. It is bad. Very bad. So bad that the usually impotent left-leaning media reacted with anger, as if they'd realised they'd been conned.
That $100,000 cheque was, I understand, actually by quite some distance, the largest donation that your campaign received. And as such, wouldn't it be exactly the kind of thing that should have caused you or your team to take notice?
Well, the difficulty is there was a mistake made from an accounting point of view by the team. The headline of the papers is misleading.
I'm not talking about a failure to disclose. I'm more talking about a lack of due diligence, I suppose. So I only use the word mistake because that's the word that you were using. When a $100,000 cheque turns up, and that is outsized compared to the other donations that you're getting, I just would have thought the obvious thing to do, especially if you care about things like political donation reform, is to investigate that and then to report what you find.
Well, I cannot believe I find myself in furious agreement with Waleed Ali. If Zali honestly expects us to believe it was a mistake as opposed to a coordinated effort to hide the identity of the donor, it raises questions about a lack of due diligence. Did she not see 8 separate donations of the exact same value and think, that's suspiciously close to the threshold. Maybe I should investigate. No, instead she swanned around Australia, demonising the coalition for its record on, that's right, coal. But the story doesn't stop here. Instead of just copping the mistake on her chin, she got combative and hit out at the journalists who broke the story. The Sydney Morning Herald's Rob Harris wrote that exclusive, and they used this headline: Climate warrior Zali Steggall failed to declare 6-figure donation from family trust of coal investor. Now, Rob Harris is a very good journalist and he's extremely details-oriented. It was an accurate headline and the story was bulletproof. Still, Zali thought she could get out of hot water by attempting to discredit the reporting. She took to Twitter saying, "Let's get the facts straight. There was no undisclosed money received by my campaign." Zali went on to disparage the journalist, saying the headline used was, quote, misleading, and then claimed that the donations were disclosed in accordance with the relevant requirements. Now, this sent her Twitter fans to attack the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Bevan Shields, suggesting his paper was responsible for inadequate reporting. He hit back, though, describing Zali's press release as clear spin, and published a statement from the Australian Electoral Commission proving Zali's team had either lied or completely stuffed up. The statement says that Zali's financial controller told the AEC that donations were of 8 individual amounts. Instead, the AEC alleges the sums came from one single cheque of $100,000, which should have been disclosed properly, but wasn't. And if you don't believe the Sydney Morning Herald story was a legitimately brilliant exclusive, have a listen to Zali herself talking last year about the need for the public to know who is donating to politicians and what those donations buy.
This bill will increase transparency. of political donations by reducing the threshold for disclosure of political donations from $14,500 to $1,000 and increasing the reporting frequency to every quarter for $1,000 donations and above. I welcome these changes. For too long, money has been hidden from view and from public scrutiny. We do not know who is paying for access to politicians and members in this place and influence over decisions.
Well, have fun at the upcoming election, Zali. Now that you've played the fake news media card, you might not get the same free run they gave you against Tony Abbott. Well, let's bring in the panel. I'm joined by lawyer and commentator Caroline De Russo and Director of Communication at the IPA, Evan Mulholland. Evan, let's start with you. What did you make of the way that Zali tried to spin the narrative of this story as if the journalists were the ones that made a mistake, the journalists were the ones who had stuffed up here?
Well, the journalists have done a good job here. It's great to see the blowtorch finally being applied to these independents. And also who's done a good job here is the Australian Electoral Commission, who turned around to her campaign and said, no, that's not the way it's going to be. You can't split it up into 5 different ways and then just hand over the $100, $1,000 cheque. You've got to actually be accountable for your own actions. So attacking the media is never going to work. And Zali Steggall, if this was a Liberal or Labor politician, would be calling for them to be referred to her hypothetical federal ICAC. So when you preach about transparency, when you preach about political donations and preach about climate change, you probably want to be as scrupulous as possible and as transparent as possible about the donations you're receiving from a former coal baron.
Yeah, well said. You'd have to be pretty drunk for this to pass the pub test, wouldn't you? And Caroline, what I took from this as well is she seemed to be very out of place. She was nervous, she was flustered. On an interview with The Project, what I get from this is these progressive politicians who aren't used to the media scrutiny, you can really see they fall apart in a way that a Conservative politician cannot simply afford to do.
Well, they're definitely not battle-hardened the same way. And look, we can go back to the 2019 election campaign, and Zali Steggall got absolutely nursed through that campaign by the media, even when there was all the conversation about why you're still driving a Prado and why haven't you bought a Tesla and all that kind of stuff. They still kind of no real skin was lost. So you can understand how this is all of a sudden very difficult for her, despite her being a barrister, and you think she'd be a little more used to an adversarial approach, because she has been caught here. The tide has gone out and she is absolutely starkers. In my view, this is no different to what happened in New South Wales Labor, except we're just missing the Chinese waiters and the Audi bag. It is precisely the same thing. This is precisely the same thing. And if it had been one of the major parties, they would have had to have explained themselves properly. All of a sudden, she's been asked to explain. She's not used to it, particularly given the view that she's taken on things like climate change and things like transparency, because there is actually no way for her to explain this absolutely rank hypocrisy.